Now, Sabbaths were also special if Ellen White was going to be speaking in a nearby church. The family loved it. Why? Well, not necessarily because Grandma was speaking. I mean, they had heard her speak. So for church members, that was special if Ellen White came to speak. But for the members, the family members, it was not quite that big a thing. But the grandchildren knew that after church, there was always a picnic. On the way back home, there was always a picnic. Now, Ellen White's daughter-in-law, Willie White's second wife, told me when I was visiting with her one time that when Ellen White spoke, in those days, there was no public address system. So Ellen White had to speak from the diaphragm and project her voice to make herself heard. Now, that takes a lot of energy. So she would be projecting her voice, and by the time she was through preaching, she was wringing wet from perspiration or from sweat. And so rather than going to the back door and shaking hands with everybody like happens in a lot of churches, why, they would take Ellen White into another room. She would dry off, completely change clothes, and by this time, most everybody had left, which was fine with the grandchildren, because what were they thinking about? Picnic lunch, because they'd been in Sabbath school church all morning. And depending on which church nearby, whether it was St. Helena or Calistoga, wherever it was, why, they knew if they went there, we're going to have a picnic lunch at this spot. The family kind of had these favorite spots. So they would go and have their picnic lunch. When they were setting up, when they'd get to the spot and they were setting up, one of the men would take the children for a little hike. While the ladies were getting the lunch out, they would take the men to get their wiggles out, because they'd been sitting for Sabbath school in church. And then they would have a lunch. And they were always warm lunches. They'd warm up their food. They didn't cook it on Sabbath, but they did warm their food on Sabbath, and they had what they called a fireless cooker that they could put it in. It apparently was insulated and kept the food warm. So they had a nice warm lunch. And then after they'd had lunch, they were not in any rush. This was a down day. Sabbath was a day to be together, to worship God, to be out in nature. It was not like the work days. So they were not in any rush. So what would they do? Well, Ellen White had a couple of things that especially Grace, the granddaughter, remembered. She said grandmother would usually ask that they read some mission letters. And during the week, she might have received a letter from Elder Daniels, the president of the General Conference, if he was traveling overseas, or some other minister, or maybe a missionary like Elder Stahl to South America, or Dr. Miller to China. I mean, different people would write. And so they would read these letters. Now, Ellen White had already read the letters during the week. So why would she have these letters read by someone on her staff on Sabbath afternoon? Well, again, as Grace especially told me, she said, grandmother was very intentional. She wanted us growing up knowing that we were part of a world church, not just the little church or even the few little churches where grandmother went to speak, or our little church. We were part of a world movement. And what's the natural way to do that? Hear these missionary letters from what's happening here or what's happening there. And so then another thing that Grace said that we often did on Sabbath afternoon was they would bring out whatever chapters for whatever books were being worked on. Now, the secretaries would have worked over the manuscripts and prepared them so they were ready to go to the printer. Ellen White would have reread them by this time to make certain that in the secretarial process and editing and making it smooth, nothing had been changed, so it still said what Ellen White wanted to say. So why are they bringing out the chapters? Why are they reading them? Well, Grace said especially Ellen White especially liked to hear her daughter-in-law, Grace's mother, May, read, because May, if I remember correctly, she was born in England, but she had grown up in India and then later in Australia. So she had a British accent. And Ellen White's accent was from the northeastern United States, from the state of Maine. And she enjoyed the beauty of the British accent. So she usually asked May to read. But Grace said, why? When grandmother had already read it, she knew it was said what she wanted to say. Well, she said two things. One is she said, I can remember my grandmother sitting there, kind of listening very intently. Why was she listening? She'd already read it. Well, because now she's hearing it read out loud. And sometimes sounds between words will clash. And Ellen White wanted to make certain that even the sounds, when you read it, that's one thing, but when you hear it read, the sounds flow, and there's no clashing of letters, the sounds. So that was one reason. But she said the other reason that was even probably more important to Ellen White was because Ellen White knew that her grandchildren were all going to have to eventually decide, is God speaking through me or is he not? And what is the best way for a person to decide whether or not God is speaking through Ellen White? Read her writings. Her writings are self-authenticating. If you can get a person to read, they can be convinced without you having to go through all kinds of arguments. So Ellen White naturally wanted her grandchildren growing up listening to the messages that God had given through her. And this was a natural way for them to decide, is God speaking through our grandmother or is he not? It's an amazing, when you stop to analyze how Ellen White educated her grandchildren and how she encouraged them to give their hearts to the Lord and to be Seventh-day Adventists, to accept her ministry. I mean, it was all very intentional, but it was done so innocently. Tell us some stories. Or, well, let's all pray. And then after the stories, or maybe before the stories, I don't know, I don't remember for sure which order she put them, then the family played games, simple family games. The family did everything together. They were very much family-oriented. They worked together, they played together. And so then that evening is over. They go back to their homes, and guess what? They're already starting to focus on what's going to happen next Sabbath, because the Sabbath was the high point in the week in Ellen White's home.